Welcome to the Disruptance Podcast. The Disruptance Podcast is the show that disrupts the way entrepreneurs think to make them more profitable and impactful. Rethink tired and outdated business norms to welcome innovation and unlock your unlimited possibilities. Here are your hosts, Eric Forney and Greg Fowler.
Oh, man. Okay, so Eric, always a pleasure. Always excited to do this, man. We got an interesting topic to kind of go through as we were dialoguing, talking about being busy versus actually being productive. So where do you want to go with that? How do you want to start that conversation for the audience today?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Greg, I think this is one of those topics that you hear about a lot. A lot of people talk about this idea of like focusing on your 20% or this idea of the Pareto principle, right? And it's almost to the point where it's become so cliche that it's just so easy to dismiss and tune out. And yet the reality of it is that arguably there's nothing more important from a business standpoint than remembering what matters and what doesn't. And so one of the things that I found recently is that we've had to be even more simple as an organization about how to communicate this. Like saying the 80-20 principle is too broad and lacks no specificity and clarity to take action on. And so the other day I was having a conversation with some of the people I work with, and I boiled it down to that there's like these three covenants of capitalism as an employee that I have to and an employee means like if I'm doing anything for the business, I'm just for the sake of this conversation calling myself an employee. And so the three covenants are that I have to generate more revenue, I have to minimize expenses, and I have to maximize time. If I'm doing anything that doesn't fall into one of those three categories, I'm doing something wrong. I cannot think that working today, doing anything other than adding revenue, increasing revenue, mitigating expenses, and maximizing time, if I've done anything other than those three, I didn't work today. So I have to ensure that most of all, the main thing is the main thing. One of those three things, that's the exchange of the income that I receive from the business. Whenever you go either start a business, you're an employee of a business, you're an entrepreneur, you signed a covenant in exchange for money. And the money covenant that you signed was that you'll maximize revenue, maximize time, and minimize expenses. That's it. If you don't do that above and beyond what you're paid, you didn't uphold your covenant.
Eric, as you're breaking that down, and for the audience that's tuning in here, that makes a ton of sense. And having those three principles that apply for the difference between being busy and being productive. And everybody runs around and says, oh, I had such a busy day. And I think that you articulating that in such a clean structure, I think is helpful. The importance of productivity and leveraging those activities to maximize your results as an agent, I think that's something that I'd love to get your perspective on. So let's just say that you're, advising the audience out that way, and you identified those three main components. How would you say, hey, Greg, this is what I would do to make sure you're maximizing revenue, you're maximizing your time and best aspects of what you're doing? Like, what would you say to that if you were just advising?
Yeah, of course. So I think that until you understand that this is a way of thinking and a belief system that it has to be an active process. And the active process, the way that I initially implemented it was that the start of every day or the end of every day, whichever one works better, ideally both, was I would start the day and then I would put dollar signs next to all of the activities that generated dollar signs, revenue or expense related. And if there was $3 signs next to an activity, it was more impactful than an activity that had $1 sign next to it. And so for me, it just became a way to like earmark what actually drove the most tangible value. Because the challenge we have is that, there's this like long-term sustainability and then there's short-term requirement. As in like, you have to get sleep, or at a certain point you die. And so,
Right.
but you also have to maintain a particular body weight, or you shorten your lifespan. Okay. And so one of them has a long-term impact on your health span and lifespan. The other one is a near-term requirement, or you don't have a long life and you don't have a long health span. And so figuring out what the balance between those can be challenging, I find, for a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of entrepreneurs, which is which one do I prioritize?
Wow.
And the answer is, I don't know. You'll figure it out. There isn't like a general rule of thumb. Like you just have to learn to make that balancing act. But you have to understand that there are differences. And so the way I think about this, Greg, is a couple of things. Is I was telling you before we jumped on about this rabbit hole I went down the other day. There's this like extreme anti-aging biohacker, Brian Johnson, who like has this $2 million a year like health routine where he's trying to reverse aging. And so you think about what his objective is. It's $2 million a year focused on trying to internally be younger, or in every single way make micro incremental gains towards reversing his aging. Okay, that's at the very extreme end of the long-term thinking.
Sure.
Most people are just trying to make healthy choices at the buffet.
Right.
And so the most important thing, though, is to make healthy choices around what you eat. That's more important than trying to reverse aging, because what you end up with these like micro incremental changes versus macro significant exponential impact. We all agree that if your diet consisted exclusively of cake, it really wouldn't matter whether you did laser therapy on your skin and you jumped in a cold plunge tank, because your lifespan and health span are not going to last longer as a result of those activities. So some things just matter more. How do you understand that? I don't know. Figure it out. Like it's just, there isn't exactly a golden rule, other than starting to quantify through that repetitious habit of defining what generates the most revenue, what mitigates expenses, and what maximizes time. It boils down to auditing that every day, reflecting on it, and then redefining it for tomorrow.
Wow. And as you're mentioning that, and you talk about the cake life, as it would be, it'd be short and sweet, as they would say.
That's right.
But I think as you're projecting the goal setting standpoints of the highest and best use of time, and then articulating it with dollar signs, I think is crucial, not just on a business standpoint, but also from personal dollar signs, right? The emotional investment into family and friends, and living outside of the realm of just work. But I think the buffet analogy is fantastic, because there's so many options as a real estate professional or entrepreneur to say, okay, what am I going to eat? What am I going to do? So break down those tasks, really have that hierarchy, and then keep coming back and evaluate that. I think is massive advice to there. Now, I want to push back on this a little bit, Eric, and I think the audience hopefully is thinking along with me. If you are, you're welcome. With this aspect, procrastination, right? It's the monkey on everybody's back. And hearing you at the highest of levels, Eric, and what you've done and continue to do in the real estate world, it means a lot coming from you. But some people would say, oh, that's easy for Eric, right? He's a machine. He does it. He's been doing it. So a lot of people put false expectations on themselves, and or they procrastinate, to doing the things, even if they know they should be doing it. So do you have any advice or perspective on getting it done? Just literally eating the frog, right? As they say, or really just kind of overcoming that procrastination monkey. If you
Well, I mean, I think that what you're saying is first we accept that it is true, in that procrastination is a truth of life. And most of the time, there's a lot of reasons and thoughts around procrastination. Most behavioral science is hardly science at best. And so we don't need to go down the road of like why we procrastinate. I think it's largely irrelevant around why. If it's me, what I do is I would audit the reasons that cause me to procrastinate, audit the things that create distractions so that I can avoid doing the things that I know that I need to do. And so what I find for me is that my phone and or my laptop become the largest distraction for me. And so one of the things I know is that my least amount of productivity happens when my laptop lid is open. The lowest amount of productivity for me is when my laptop is open. And that's because what I do is I get like 400 browser tabs open at a time. And then any thought that comes into my head, I can go look at a browser tab. And so I put parameters in place to try to prevent me from being me by pre-deciding what actions I'm going to take in advance. And then put guardrails around the distractions before the distractions occur. So I know that every morning I have an app that I download and subscribe to called Freedom. I know that my phone will block me for 3 hours every day from getting on any app that will cause a single bit of distraction. I can't get on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, news websites, nothing. I can't do it on my laptop, nothing. Right? I've got then my browser blocks me, and there's an extension. I don't know if I've shown it to you or not, but it says get the fuck to work. Anytime I try to go to a website that's distracting,
I love it.
Pops up and blocks that tab and reminds me to get back to work. And so I pre-decide what distractions I'm going to avoid prior to those showing up in my life, because what I know is that when given the choice, I'll likely make the wrong choice. And so environmental design becomes more important than willpower.
Wow. As you're mentioning that though, Eric, it's really talking about being honest with yourself. Kind of as you stated, just admitting that these are the facts of life and this is how you're wired. So being very honest that way, developing a setup and an environment and processes that you can accomplish your goals and not getting your own way is crucially important. I think that not everybody has that knowledge or expertise or mentor in their life to project that. That's why we're here. We're here to guide and to share information that people can apply and really do that. And there's tools. At the end of the day, I think that it's just the daily activities and consistencies in nature that form habits. And I think that that's really it. It's extremely difficult to form those habits. And Eric, do you know the stats? I think it's like, what is it? 90 days or is it 60 days?
66 days on average. Yeah.
There you go. So, I mean, people can't commit to something for 6 minutes,
let
alone 66 days.
And so I think that when you understand that business is a group of people following a set of predefined systems and processes in order to get duplicatable and replicatable expected results, that the first key component of that equation is people. And when you understand that the biggest challenge for people is establishing habits, then as a business owner, you start to look at how do you address the habits. And very rarely do you address habits by layering in accountability. One of the most effective ways is by designing environment rather than trying to manage behavior. And so for me, I think about it first is that you have to accept the fact that behaviors are incredibly difficult to establish when you're trying to establish a new habit, a new behavior. That if it takes on average 66 days to establish a new habit and you don't get it right the first time, good news. You're not really supposed to, right? But you're biologically, evolutionarily designed to not be great at establishing new habits.
Hmm.
because it's taxing on your nervous system to start an entirely new routine. Can you imagine going across the Oregon Trail with nothing to eat, and you're trying to start a new habit every day along the way? Like, you're going to decide to wake up at 4 a.m. or 3 hours earlier, or you're going to decide to go to the gym and, add all these new behaviors in when your body's trying to conserve energy. It just would be foolery to think that we were wired to do new things. Biologically, the thought would be is that you're wired to have sex, reproduce, stay alive, and therefore, if that's at the fundamental first principles of life, it's difficult to start anything that would disrupt that biological wiring of have sex, reproduce, stay alive. And so new habits are incredibly taxing, and which is why we engineer environments to help force that, rather than rely on willpower or shame as a more effective methodology.
And so you bring up a really good point into that, talking about human nature and just kind of evolutionary standpoints there. I think a big misconception, or maybe not, I'd love to get your opinion or perspective on this, Eric, is talent. So same principle applies with, there's a lot of people that are extremely, if not wildly talented, right? But is it overrated? Is it the talent? Is it the work and determination, consistency? Some people say I'll outwork, the smartest person in the room.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on talent when you're out there, and obviously talking about your team organization, but then also you in addition, and other professionals around the globe? What are your thoughts on that perspective, talent versus the work, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, that's a tough philosophical topic as well, in the sense that if we're talking about the perspective of becoming an NBA basketball player, the likelihood of you being the next Spud Webb at 5'7" is incredibly unlikely. But if we're talking about business, then talent becomes a little it becomes certainly an important component. However, it's not the only component of success. I love all things Naval Ravikant, and I know I finally talked you into reading the book. And one of the things that Naval says that you want to hire for is this like three-legged stool of effective hiring, which is intellect, integrity, and energy.
Wow.
Intellect, integrity, and energy. And so nowhere does he say you want to hire the most talented person. But you want to hire somebody who's motivated, inspired, and driven. That's the energy component. You want to hire someone with intellect, and I think of that as they have the capacity to learn. They don't have to have the skill, the talent today, but they have to have the ability to learn in order to acquire the talent, the skills that are necessary. And then integrity, right? Otherwise, what you end up with is really smart, energetic people who eventually steal from you. And so if they lack the integrity, then you'll end up in a situation that you'll eventually regret. And that integrity component is, I think of it as, are you willing to do things that harm you in order to maintain your self-respect?
Wow.
And so are you willing to do things that would harm you in order to maintain self-respect? And I think of that as like, if we make an agreement about how business will be handled, and we are in alignment and we sign that alignment, am I willing to uphold that agreement even if it doesn't benefit me or causes me to lose in this particular situation? Because with integrity, I said yes to our agreement up front. And there are plenty of people who will not do that. And so oftentimes the only one who knows is you, the person who signed it, who stands to lose. Unfortunately, oftentimes people will opt to not go that route, which is not who you want to be in business with.
I agree with that 100%. I think ultimately it's not the person that you want to be either.
Yeah, hopefully not, right?
Yeah,
Like,
no one goes out there saying, "Ha, this is what I'm going
yeah,
to turn myself into." But I think there's so many correlations into life, into business, as you mentioned that, and decision making, and really analyzing those perspectives and opportunities. Eric, to me, it makes a ton of sense, and that's the whole goal for this, is just really to apply this knowledge for people to add perspective, to really overstep mistakes, or at least learn from others, and then really provide perspective. To me, this is kind of one of those additional thought processes that I'd love to get your opinion and perspective on, Eric, is being prepared. So we're talking about all these activities that we're doing, and obviously mindset, and lack of procrastination, really taking massive action, having directives. But when you talk about getting in front of somebody, if it's a listing appointment, or if you're talking about with a buyer, or if it's for growth and development for a team, potential clientele, if you're on stage, you're doing a podcast like this, what are your thoughts on winging it
yeah,
versus being prepared?
yeah.
Where's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to answer that in 1 second. I want to go back to an interesting example of integrity
Do
that I
it.
think is real world, is and timely right now, is when you think about Threads and Twitter. The Threads was
Yep.
built by ex-Twitter employees.
Hmm.
And what I would then argue are employees who lacked integrity, right? And it's the former employees who lacked integrity, who were willing to do something that they signed up for one company to build, and then opted to instead trade their integrity for money to go
Wow.
build a comparable competing product.
Hmm.
There are some people who said no to that offer. And then there are those who lacked the integrity and said yes to whatever the offer was. Right. Like I know in my contract that I agreed not to go work for X companies
Sure.
in the future. And I can't imagine thinking for 1 second about going to work at those places, because I agreed with good faith to not do that. And so we see that integrity challenge show up oftentimes across multiple businesses. And even if you get a huge offer, you still say no, and that becomes harm to you, the individual who has to say no, because you agreed up front that you would do that in that if that situation arises. Gary Keller talks about this a lot. He said, it's not an operating agreement, it's an operating disagreement. And the operating disagreement tells us how we will act once we disagree on operations. Right. And my wife and I have a marital agreement. And one, because that's incredibly, one, it was a requirement, and two, it's something that Gary preaches nonstop to us. And so one, it was a requirement from a business standpoint, given the business relationships that we have. And then two, we chose with good faith and excitement to do that, because we predetermined, if we disagree on these items, how will we resolve them in the future? But it started from the singular place, Greg, of what's the actual ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to stay happily married forever. Awesome.
Yes.
Then what will we do when we don't do that? If that, God forbid, that we get to a place where that's not the direction, or that's not happening, how will we act if and when we get to that point in the future? And so I just love the fact that it gives you tons of clarity up front by making that pre-decision and that pre-agreement to decide how you'll act when you disagree in the future, and then memorializing it. So it's just kind of the interesting way that I think about integrity, is that you make an agreement and then you take action, even if it causes you to be the one who loses in the end.
I want to unpack that a little bit. Two massive topics that you kind of dove a little bit deeper into, Eric, and I think it's fascinating. The first thing on the integrity piece, and not sorry to Mark Zuckerberg if we're throwing shade, his direction,
right.
Talking about that way. But what I would say is, judgment can get clouded under so many different circumstances into life, and emotions, right, can get involved. And there is a level of character and integrity, as you mentioned, and everyone's different. If we're all the same, it'd be boring. However, I look at it from that standpoint, a personal perspective. I know that certain things can judge and cloud decision making. For me personal, I had an opportunity to work with an organization. It was a massive amount of money for me at that time, and I let it cloud my judgment based off of decisions that I should have made, and I signed a 2-year contract. And I will tell you, one of the worst decisions I ever made, and I did it because of money. And I don't want to say that it was from a greedy nature or from a clouded place, but at the end of the day, I looked at the dollar signs. And I will tell you, anytime somebody asks me, hey, what would you do? What would you have done? I say your decision should not be predicated based off the money. You need to trust your gut. You need to understand what you're doing into that. So it is interesting. I'm not giving those individuals at Twitter and now at Thread an excuse, but they might have been clouded in judgment of dollar signs, and they might have had a moment of weakness. And I think that everyone's human in nature, but what I would educate anybody who's tuning into this is think really hard about that decision. At least for me, anytime I've made a decision that way when it comes to money, it's been the wrong one. That's just me personally. Everyone lives their own life and their own journey. I think in correlation to, marital status or situation, to me, cooler heads prevail. And I have not been divorced myself. We've been happily married for 14 years. I love my wife. She's wonderful. But at the end of the day, you got to look at it from a standpoint of making decisions when you are in a great place is going to provide clarity.
Yeah.
Ultimately, when and or if something negative happens, you've established those, parameters. And I think to me, from a business standpoint, not that we're talking about marital advice here, Eric, but I think from the direct correlation to business, make decisions in cool situations. Don't make snap judgments. Never look at it from making a life-changing or altering decision in a point of weakness. More so, try to be in a point of strength, clarity, and understanding what's going on. And I think that no matter what the situation happens into the future, because no one has a crystal ball, you're going to be in great shape, at least in the best case of scenarios. I don't know how you feel about that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're scaling a business, and I don't know that there's a lot more difficult than scaling, especially scaling in professional service business. And so the thing that I remind people in the organization is don't make long-term decisions with short-term thinking. And because it's easy to get caught up in the frustrations of the moment, but decisions that are a one-way door only lead one way. And if we're not walking through the door with a long-range perspective about whether you'll regret walking through that door based on how you feel in the moment, then you've likely made a bad decision. And so thinking around the long-range perspective by defining it up front, I think is the best framework to operate from. People will ask me a lot of times, Greg, they'll say, well, why did you join Livian? That's probably the most common question that I get, right? Is we were, I think, we were the number one team in KW in Indiana. And, by all intents and measures and purposes, we were incredibly successful. And, Adam's a good friend of mine, and we never discussed working together. Never one time did it come up that I was going to join the organization. He didn't sell me on it, and vice versa. And because the reality is we didn't need the organization. And yet when Adam called and said, hey, do you want to do this? We're going to need leaders. This is the goal. This is the vision. This is what Gary and I want to do. Do you want to be a part of it? It was actually a really easy decision. And the decision was simple. And the thought process was, if I'm 80 years old, will I be glad that I did, or will I regret that I didn't? And it was a very simple, clear answer of, do I think that I could learn something from two great leaders and the most successful person, who self-made billionaire in real estate, number one selling real estate author, and largest real estate company in the world? Do you think that I could learn something from him that will be a long-term benefit for me, for my family, for the future? And is it worth not getting 100% of the credit for whatever success the company has? I think it's a fair trade. And it was an easy decision because it was really clear that I would rather do it and fail than regret never doing it at all.
I absolutely love that mentality. And I think that that's the biggest regret, is not doing, or it's not the fact that you did it, but that you didn't take the chance. I think that's where, the studies have done and what people say.
Yeah.
It's I think ultimately that's a very personal decision. Everybody has different risk tolerances and, situations into their lives. I think ultimately there are excuses that we surround ourselves to comfort. Those are the boundaries that we place upon ourselves. Life is short, period. I mean, I was having a conversation this morning with an electrician and young guy, and it was just really great to kind of hear his life and perspective. He asked what I did for a living, and I told him, and it was just one of those things where I said, hey, as I've aged over time, and not that I'm some old man in a walker or a
Totally.
razor scooter, but I've learned quite a bit in this time frame that I've been here, and it goes fast. It's not a cliche. It's not one of those things,
Yeah.
oh, time flies, a blink of an eye. I mean, it's nuts. My daughter is turning 5 on Friday.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember that very clearly. 5 years, it just boom, 5 years. I mean, I think ultimately we have to make these decisions, as you had mentioned, project yourself as an 80-year-old man or woman and say, hey, what legacy am I living? What life am I building here? How am I spending my time on this planet with these people that are around me, personally and professionally, and make the right decision. I mean, there's so many short-term decisions that you had stated, and they're not looking far enough down the road. You had used the kind of a rear view mirror analogy, from a racing standpoint. There's a reason why the windshield is so much bigger than the rear view mirror. I mean, you need to be constantly looking forward, and it's not just on a tunnel vision scenario. You really want to be opening your eyes out forward. And so many people and professionals, they have tunnel vision, where they're at, what they should do, what's going on.
Yeah.
And they don't listen to other top tier professionals because they think they know it all. They're there, and they're not opening their eyes to saying, wow, I didn't realize that I had all these other viewing angles to gather data to make the best decision for my line so that I can improve my lap time. Right. Using that as a racing analogy, but that's a life analogy. And I just love everything that you're stating here, Eric. It's very, very pertinent information for the audience.
One of the things that helps with that, I think, Greg, is I found, and I was sitting in a dentist chair this morning, and I had a root canal, and so the lesson I learned was I should floss more. But two, I was listening to the Business Wars podcast, and I say the lesson is to study other businesses as a business owner. Because what you end up with is perspective, but what you can't do is study business headlines and business articles. You have to study business retrospectives. You have to actually get the granular understanding of what someone's business looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, because what you're looking for is these like timeless fundamentals that repeat themselves. And so to quantify that a little bit more, I was listening to Business Wars podcast, and they talked about when Target expanded into Canada. And when they expanded into Canada, something like 70% of the stores of the company's SKUs were wrong. And a number of reasons why. One of them was they didn't translate from the metric system to the imperial system properly. And then they tried to save money by hiring short-term part-time labor to input all of that data into their system. And they ended up with a bunch of errors. They said, hey, get it done really fast. But what they didn't prioritize was get it done really fast with 100% accuracy. So they ended up with a ton of data that was wrong. And so when I hear that, I go, that's really stupid. I can't imagine sitting around that boardroom and hearing that when they go to launch the opening of Target in Canada, and then they can't because none of the product is there on time for their grand opening, because that sounds like a really dumb thing that you would avoid. You would especially think that Target would have been able to avoid it as the second largest retailer in America. Right. And yet in 2012, they made that same mistake. And so if Target's making that mistake, I guess it makes sense that I would run into similar challenges where you would think that they're completely and utterly avoidable. And yet the nature of it is that a business first starts with people. And when you end up with people, what you end up with is a lot of variance in outcomes. And so as a byproduct of that, if Target had that same mistake, next time something significant that seems entirely avoidable shows up, I'll give myself, the company, and the people more grace.
It's a part of that directive or conversation to have in collaboration with the people you surround yourself with. But ultimately, as we are kind of mentioning or discussing, being prepared. There's so many people that they're drivers. They want to get things done and moving, and done is better than perfect, and all these different adages that are thrown out there. But there has to be a level of preparation, in my opinion. And you have to really understand, as you're mentioning, Eric, okay, what's the end goal for this? And then looking at it from a proven sort of metric into what are the reverse engineered steps to get it done with the most ability for accuracy and intent to really accelerate, but in a realistic time frame. And then more importantly, the personnel or the individuals who are doing those activities, and then kind of rounding everything out, as you had mentioned, with accountability, right? Structure, accountability, really kind of going down that line. So to me, I think there's a lot to be taken away from this episode, Eric. I mean, I know that there's so many processes and perspectives that the audience has been able to kind of soak up here. But is there anything you want to wrap everything up with this episode here? Anything that sticks out to you at all?
No, I mean, I love that you touch on one point though, which is, and I hate cliches more than anything. But the adage of begin with the end in mind is what stuck out. And again, I hate the cliches because most of the time they mean nothing, right? They become just watered down milk toast. And so when I think of that is define what problem you're solving for, and when you get there, what it will look like. And when you get to your destination, what will it look like, and what problem are you solving for? When you know that, then you work backwards. So to quantify this so that someone could go take action on it is, if you said, hey, I want to go on a family vacation. I have this conversation with my agents all the time because I hold them accountable to taking vacation when that's on their list of annualized goals. And so almost invariably, the question I will ask them is, what do you want to see when you go on vacation? What do you want to experience when you go on vacation? If you tell me a destination, I'm not going to accept that. So if you tell me I want to go and I want to build memories of my kids doing XYZ, awesome. Now we've narrowed down our focus of all the places you could go, because maybe Disney World wouldn't actually give you the memories that you seek. Maybe the memories you seek are backpacking the Appalachia, because that's actually what problem you're trying to solve for, or what you want to see when you become successful in going on that vacation. So defining what success will look like when you get there and what problem you're solving for before taking action makes plan building and action taking far more effective and meaningful, so that you actually end up getting what you want in the end.